What if you sat down at the wrong table at a wedding and ended up next to the only person who could truly see you? And what if the man you met in a moment of silence was the one who finally made you feel heard? Margot Hale wasn't supposed to be there. Not at the wedding, not in the dress she barely believed still fit, not sitting beside a stranger when all she wanted was to disappear quietly into the background. But then Daniel Whitaker sat down, and the room changed. He didn't ask for her story. He listened for the spaces between her sentences. He didn't reach for her hand. He waited until she was ready to offer it. Two people, both marked by loss, both fluent in solitude, neither of them looking for something new until it found them anyway. Can a single evening rewrite the way we see ourselves? Can you trust someone who offers you nothing but presence and means it? And what if the love we're meant to find doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with stillness? If you've ever been moved by quiet connection, by love that arrives not to rescue, but to witness, like, share, and subscribe to shining stories. Because sometimes the most powerful beginnings are the ones that whisper. Now, let's begin. Sometimes it's not the loudest moments that change you. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones where you barely speak, barely move, barely feel anything at all until something shifts. Margot Hale hadn't wanted to come. The morning of the wedding, she'd stood in front of her closet for nearly 45 minutes, staring blankly at the rows of muted dresses she hadn't touched in years. In the end, she settled on a soft plum-colored dress with long sleeves and a slightly faded hem, a dress that whispered presentable more than it did celebratory. That felt about right. The invitation had come from Cindy, her closest friend from college. "You have to come," Cindy had pleaded. "I won't survive my niece's wedding without a buffer, and it's time you wore lipstick again." Margot had smiled through the phone, but her chest had tightened at the word again. It wasn't that she hadn't left the house since her husband died 3 years ago. She had. She worked. She shopped for groceries. She watered the plants and paid her bills. But something inside her, some warm, flickering center, had quietly dimmed. The lipstick sat in a drawer, dusty and untouched. The wedding was held at a rustic estate in Vermont, the kind with refurbished barns and fairy lights wrapped around oak trees. People laughed under canopies of golden leaves and clinked glasses filled with champagne and cheer. Margot felt like a faded sketch in a room full of paintings. She arrived just before the ceremony, slipped into a seat near the back, and kept her coat draped across her lap. Her eyes scanned the crowd, looking for Cindy, but quickly gave up. She wasn't here to mingle. She was here to fulfill an old promise to a friend who had never stopped trying to pull her back into life. When the ceremony ended and the guests began drifting toward the reception hall, Margot hung back. She moved slowly, deliberately, avoiding eye contact, and found an empty table tucked against a window. The autumn light spilled through the glass, catching the silverware and making everything look warmer than it felt. She let out a soft breath and placed her hands on the tablecloth, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle. The room began to fill around her heels, clicking against hardwood, silver laughter, music that dipped and rose like it belonged to someone else's life. Margot watched it all through the filter of detachment, as if she were underwater. "Still you," she murmured to herself, a quiet reminder not to bolt too soon. As guests took their seats and waiters circled with hors d'oeuvres, she glanced at the empty chair beside her. For a second, she allowed herself to imagine someone interesting, quiet, thoughtful, taking that spot. Then she shook her head and reached for her glass of water. She didn't believe in cinematic coincidences. Not anymore. But life, it seemed, wasn't finished with surprises. The seat beside her remained empty for a while. Margot let her gaze drift across the room, not really seeing anything, just the blur of candlelight on glassware, the rise and fall of conversation, the occasional flash of silver cutlery in motion. She took another sip of water, savoring the neutrality of it. Everything else felt too loud, too bright. Then, a quiet voice broke through the hum around her. "Is this seat taken?" It wasn't the words that startled her. It was the tone, low, steady, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't seek attention but held it anyway. Margot turned. He was tall, maybe just over 6 feet, but didn't carry himself with the arrogance tall men sometimes did. His charcoal gray blazer was simple, but well cut, his dark hair neatly combed back, with threads of silver at the temples that gave his face more character than polish. His eyes were a deep gray blue, unreadable, but not cold. "No," she said, adjusting slightly in her chair. "Not at all." He offered a nod of thanks before settling in beside her, placing his wine glass down with a careful touch. For a few moments, they sat in silence. Not uncomfortable, not forced, just quiet. "I'm Daniel," he said after a moment, turning slightly toward her. "Daniel Whitaker." "Margot Hale," she replied, matching his tone. "Friend of the bride." He smiled faintly. "Friend of the groom." Or, more accurately, business associate turned reluctant wedding guest. Margot allowed a quiet laugh to slip out. Reluctant. "You're already braver than most." "I considered faking a cold this morning." Daniel chuckled, the sound soft but genuine. "You and me both." There was an easiness to his presence that Margot hadn't expected. He didn't lean in too close or let his eyes wander. He seemed entirely present, like someone who knew how to exist in a moment without trying to own it. The waiter approached with menus, but Daniel gently waved him off. "I'll have what she's having," he said, nodding to Margot's untouched plate. "It seems like a safe bet." She tilted her head. "You trust strangers that easily?" He smiled, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly, only the ones who look like they're about to slip out the back door. That caught her off guard. "Am I that obvious?" "No," he said, "but you're watching the exits more than the dance floor, which usually means one of two things. You're either a highly trained bodyguard or you're looking for an escape." She studied him then, unsure whether to feel exposed or intrigued. There was no edge to his words, no judgment, just observation. And somehow, that made it worse. Or better. "I'm here as moral support," she said eventually. "For my friend Cindy, it's her niece's wedding," she insisted. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, you look like someone who's keeping track of how long is polite to stay before disappearing." Margot glanced down at her lap, then back at him. "You read people well. I read rooms well," he said. "People are more complicated." He sipped his wine, then added, "But sometimes, not that complicated." They paused again. The clink of glasses and occasional bursts of laughter filled the air around them, but neither seemed in a rush to join it. It was strange, Margot thought, how easy it was to talk to someone she didn't know, and how difficult it had been, for years, to talk to those she did. "Why did you come?" she asked him, surprising even herself with the question. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and then said, "Because I didn't want to say no to something that might matter, even if I didn't know how yet." Margot felt her breath catch just slightly. There it was again, that sense of something shifting. And just like that, the seat beside her wasn't just filled, it meant something. The clinking of cutlery faded into the background. The music, once insistently cheerful, became a soft murmur beneath the hush that had settled at their table. Margot hadn't meant to linger in the conversation, but there was something disarming about Daniel Whitaker, not just his voice or his posture, but the way he didn't try to fill every silence. She'd spent years around people who talked to avoid stillness. Daniel, it seemed, valued it. Their dinner plates arrived, but neither of them rushed to eat. Margot gently unfolded her napkin, smoothing it over her lap, watching the steam curl off her food. She stole a glance at him. "Can I ask you something a bit odd?" she said. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression open. Odd questions are often the most honest. "Go ahead." Margot paused. "Why are you sitting here next to a stranger when you could probably charm half the room?" He smiled, but there was no smugness in it. "Charm exhausts me. Presence doesn't." She studied him, unsure whether she believed him or not. And yet, she wanted to. "I spend most of my time in rooms where everyone's selling something," he continued. "An idea, a product, a version of themselves they think will get them what they want. I'm not interested in that anymore." "So, what are you interested in?" Margot asked. Daniel considered this for a long moment. "Stillness," he said. genuine connection, unpolished conversations, and lately, the kind of people who don't feel the need to perform. Margot let the words sit between them. She wasn't used to being described without being named. She lifted her wine glass, taking a small sip. "I edit books," she said, almost abruptly. "Stories, mostly. Sometimes academic papers. Lately, cookbooks. Do you like it?" "I'm good at it," she answered, which wasn't really the question. Daniel caught the nuance. "But do you love it?" Margot hesitated. "I used to love the process, the quiet of it, fixing broken sentences, helping someone else find clarity. It gave me purpose. And now, she said quietly, I just try to get through the day without too much noise." Daniel nodded slowly. "I get that." They returned to their meals. Margot found herself eating more slowly than usual, not because of nerves, but because every moment felt unusually present, as if she were waking up inside her own life for the first time in years. "I used to collect old letters," Daniel said, setting down his fork. Margot blinked. Letters, handwritten ones. From antique shops, estate sales, even flea markets. It started as a curiosity, but over time, I became obsessed with the way people used to talk to each other when there was no instant reply, no emojis, just ink and waiting. "That's beautiful," she said. He shrugged gently. They felt real, messy, earnest. Even the spelling mistakes made them human. Margot looked down at her plate. "I used to write letters too, to my husband. After he died, the words came out before she could stop them." Daniel didn't flinch or fill the silence. He simply waited, respectfully quiet. "I never sent them." "Of course," she added. "Just kept them in a drawer. It helped, for a while. I think," he said softly, "writing to someone, even if they'll never read it, is one of the bravest things a person can do." His voice was steady, not pitying, not overly soft. Just there. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, Margot's throat tightened. For the first time in what felt like years, someone wasn't trying to fix her or change the subject. He was simply bearing witness, not to her grief, necessarily, but to her being. That, she realized, was rarer than she had allowed herself to remember. "You're very good at listening," she said finally. Daniel gave a quiet smile. "People forget it's a skill." Margot smiled back, and in that smile was the faint, tentative recognition of something she had once believed was lost for good, the feeling of being seen. The next hour unfolded like a slow, careful melody, no sudden shifts, just the steady rhythm of two people unexpectedly attuned to each other. Around them, the wedding bloomed in full-color laughter, dancing, glasses raised in joy, but at table 9, time moved differently. Margot hadn't felt this kind of stillness in years, not the silence of loneliness, the stillness of being safe. After dessert, something chocolate, too sweet to finish. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching the golden fairy lights blink lazily across the ceiling. "You ever notice how weddings are full of hope and heartbreak?" At the same time, he asked. Margot raised an eyebrow. "That's a bit cynical for someone who came willingly." Daniel shrugged. "Not cynical, just honest." She tilted her head, inviting more. He glanced down at his glass, rotating it slightly. The wine left soft arcs on the inside of the crystal, like quiet reminders. "I lost my younger brother 8 years ago," he said finally. "Car accident. He was 31, on his way to propose to someone he swore was the love of his life." Margot's heart dropped into a quiet ache. She didn't expect him to go there not so soon, not here, with music in the background and the scent of flowers hanging in the air. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Daniel gave a nod. He was the one who loved weddings. Always said they were the best kind of fiction. All the people dressed up like hope. Every table a new chapter. Margot smiled sadly. "Sounds like someone I would have liked." "He was chaos," Daniel said, and for the first time, his voice cracked barely, but enough to catch. "Loud, funny, bright, and everything I wasn't." She let the silence sit between them, soft and respectful, and after he died, he continued, I stopped showing up to things like this. For years, it all felt irrelevant, like I was moving through a world that didn't realize he was gone. Margot looked down at her hands. I know that feeling, she said, voice low. When my husband passed, it felt like the world didn't pause, not even for a moment. People kept grocery shopping, kids went to school, and I just stopped. Daniel turned his gaze to her, not with curiosity, but recognition. She took a breath. For months, I couldn't even hold a pen. I'd sit at my desk and just stare at the keyboard, as if words were something that belonged to another life. He nodded slowly. I didn't go near my brother's old apartment for 2 years. His fiancée asked me to help pack it up. I said I would. I didn't. Couldn't. Margot's eyes softened. Did you ever go? Yes, he said. Last spring. I found a shoebox under his bed filled with letters, some he wrote, some he never sent, all addressed to her. He paused. I gave them to her. Unopened. Margot swallowed. That was generous. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. They sat in the afterglow of shared memory. Two people, bound not by romance or nostalgia, but by the quiet, brutal honesty of loss. Margot broke the silence, her voice gentler than she realized. Do you ever feel like moving on is a betrayal? Daniel considered that. Yes, he admitted, but I also think staying frozen is its own kind of betrayal. Of them, of ourselves. Her chest tightened. She wasn't used to this kind of conversation. She was used to check-ins, platitudes, and people changing the subject when the air got too heavy. But Daniel didn't flinch from it. If anything, he leaned in. And you, he asked softly. Have you found your way out of the freeze? I'm here, she said, not quite smiling. That's a start. He nodded, then raised his glass in a quiet gesture. To showing up, he said. Margot lifted hers too. To what's left of us. She replied. They clinked glasses, not in celebration, but in reverence. A small, honest toast to survival. And in that moment, something inside her shifted, not entirely melted, but cracked, just enough for light to begin finding its way back in. The dance floor pulsed just beyond the edges of their quiet table. Laughter rose in bursts like waves, bright and careless, while children twirled in their party shoes and older couples moved in tender, unhurried steps. But Margot and Daniel remained seated, anchored to the moment, suspended in something both familiar and startlingly new. I didn't think this night would go anywhere, Margot admitted, watching the slow rotations of the chandelier overhead. I came to disappear, not connect. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Funny, I came hoping I'd be ignored. She turned toward him, half smiling. We really messed that up, didn't we? Terribly. The breeze from a nearby open window caught a strand of her hair, and without thinking, she tucked it behind her ear. Daniel watched her hands more than her face, noticed how they moved deliberately, like someone used to fixing what's fragile. Do you ever think, he said slowly, that people like us, quiet people, private people, are just as desperate for connection as anyone else, but we've convinced ourselves we don't deserve it? Margot didn't answer right away. She let the question settle, let it pierce. I don't think I ever said it out loud, she replied, but yes, sometimes I think I wear solitude like armor, like if I stay still enough, no one will expect me to offer more than I have left. Daniel nodded, not breaking her gaze. But what if you have more than you think? A silence stretched between them, thick with implication. Margot stood then, slowly, smoothing her dress with steady fingers. Her heart fluttered, not with fear exactly, but with a sudden, acute awareness of herself, her body, her presence, her choice. Walk with me, she asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. He stood, and they slipped out a side door into the cool evening. The estate grounds were scattered with lanterns and curling ivy, and the night had a softness to it, the kind that made you want to speak in whispers. They followed a narrow stone path that curved around the back of the property and opened into a small garden tucked away from the celebration. Margot stopped near a wooden bench. "I used to love gardens," she said, brushing her hand across the top of a rose bush. "My husband and I planted one behind our house. It was his way of calming his mind. I just liked the color." "What happened to it?" Daniel asked gently. "I let it die," she said. "Not on purpose. I just couldn't bring myself to touch it after he was gone. It felt wrong, like it was ours. And then it wasn't." Daniel didn't fill the space with pity. He simply stood beside her, hands in his pockets, offering nothing but presence. She exhaled. "You're not what I expected. Is that good or bad? I haven't decided yet." He smiled. "Fair enough." They sat down on the bench, a modest two-seater worn smooth by time, the kind of seat that invited confession. Margot turned toward him slightly. "What do people usually assume about you?" Daniel considered this. "That I'm aloof, calculated, that I always have an angle. And do you not tonight?" She looked away, watching the distant shadows move in the flicker of lantern light. "I don't do this," she whispered, "whatever this is." Daniel didn't ask her to define it. Instead, he spoke with a softness that didn't demand anything. "Neither do I." Another pause, another glance held longer than it needed to be. Then, quietly, he asked, "May I hold your hand?" Margot froze for a breath, not because she was offended, but because it had been so long since anyone asked. She nodded. His fingers were warm, his grip gentle. No assumptions, no pressure, just connection, simple and human. And it was there, in that small, unassuming garden, that Margot Hale realized something she hadn't dared believe in years. She could still be moved, still be seen, still be chosen. Not because she was someone's memory or someone's responsibility, but because she was her. The next morning, Margot woke up earlier than usual. There was a different texture to her thoughts, not quite lightness, but something near it, something like motion. She moved through her routine with slow precision coffee in the French press, a bowl of oatmeal she barely touched, and the comforting scent of morning light filling her kitchen window. Still, Daniel Whitaker lingered in her mind like a page she'd dog-eared but hadn't yet turned. And it wasn't just the way he spoke, or the gentleness in his voice. It was the way he looked at her, like he wasn't waiting to be impressed, like he wasn't trying to figure out how much she was worth. Later that day, Cindy called, "Did you survive?" Her voice crackled with amusement. Margot smiled into the receiver. "Somehow, I saw you talking to Daniel," Cindy teased. "He's not usually so sociable." Margot hesitated. "You know him well?" "Not really. He's a client of my brother-in-law. Business stuff. I think big finance world, very under-the-radar type." Margot's brow furrowed slightly. "Finance? Oh, yeah, quietly loaded, I think. But he's never flashy. Doesn't throw around his money or name." Margot felt a small shift inside her, like a note being struck that hadn't quite resolved. She didn't like the word loaded. It made everything feel transactional. That evening, curiosity got the better of her. She opened her laptop, typed Daniel Whitaker into the search bar and paused. There were dozens of results. CEO of a multinational investment firm, featured in Forbes, Fortune, and The Atlantic, known for turning failing companies into thriving ones with a hands-off. Values first approach. Estimated net worth over $200 million. Margot sat back in her chair, suddenly aware of the coffee stain on her worn robe and the chipped ceramic mug in her hand. He hadn't said a word, not a hint, not a trace of it in his tone or posture. Just a man at a table, eating slowly, listening carefully. Still, it made her feel foolish, like she'd walked into a play without realizing she was standing opposite the lead actor. The next afternoon, she found herself back at the small bookshop downtown. It was where she went when she didn't know what else to do. The smell of paper and time always helped her think. She was flipping through a collection of essays when a familiar voice came from behind her. "I had a feeling I might find you here." Margot turned, startled. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in the pockets of a navy wool coat. He looked rested, grounded. "How?" she asked, half smiling. half defensive. You mentioned once that bookstores are where you go to breathe. Margot raised an eyebrow. So now you're following me? No, he said with a slight grin. I'm paying attention. She laughed softly, reluctantly. They walked together through the narrow aisles, shoulders almost brushing. The quiet between them felt natural, like a language all its own. When they reached the poetry section, Margot stopped. I Googled you, she said. Daniel didn't flinch. I figured you might. You didn't tell me. I didn't hide it. Not the same thing. He nodded. You're right. She looked at him. Really looked. Why not say something? Daniel leaned against the shelf, his expression unreadable but not distant. Because I'm not used to people meeting me without already knowing. And I liked how you looked at me, like I was just someone. Margot's breath caught. I didn't want you thinking this was some kind of performance, he added, that I was trying to impress you. But it changes things, she said. Quiet now. Not because of the money, but because I don't know what's real yet. Daniel stepped closer, not invading her space, but making his presence undeniable. I'm real, he said simply. You don't have to believe that yet, but I need you to know it matters to me that you do. She swallowed hard, unsure where her fear ended and her instinct began. You intimidate me, she confessed. He offered the faintest smile. You ground me. And with those 4 words, the power shifted not into imbalance, but into truth. Because in that moment, Margot realized he might have been the man behind empires. But here, in this quiet corner of a bookshop, he was just a man, hoping to be seen for who he was, not what he owned. Margot didn't call him for 5 days. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even fear, not in the way she usually knew it. It was something quieter, something harder to explain. She felt a wall go up, not around him, but inside herself. A quiet, self-protective instinct, the kind that whispered, "This is where people like you get left behind." She moved through her days on autopilot editing manuscripts, drinking lukewarm coffee, dodging Cindy's curious texts. She avoided the bookshop. She avoided mirrors. But mostly, she avoided thinking about the man with storm-colored eyes who had changed the tone of her life in just one evening. On the 6th morning, a letter arrived in her mailbox. Not an email, not a text, a letter, handwritten, on heavy paper. The envelope was simple, her name in ink, no return address. She read it 3 times before she let herself breathe. Margot, I want to say something that doesn't ask for a reply. You don't owe me one. I just want you to know this without me standing in front of you. I meant every word I said. And I understand that the truth of who I am, the pieces of my life I didn't offer right away, might complicate how you feel. That's fair, but I didn't withhold out of pride. I did it out of hope. That maybe, just once, someone would see me without the backdrop, without the numbers, without the noise. If you need space, I respect it. If you need silence, I'll honor it. But if there's even a sliver of you that's still curious, still willing to find out who we might be, outside of expectations, I'm here. No rehearsals, no masks. Just real. Daniel Margot closed her eyes, the paper still warm from her hands. There was no manipulation in the words, no urgency, just truth, quiet and deliberate, like him. She set the letter on the kitchen counter, next to a chipped mug and a stack of unpaid bills, and stared at it like it had the power to rewrite her story. That night, she sat on her porch in an oversized sweater and listened to the autumn wind rustle through the trees. She thought about how hard it had been to trust anyone since Ben died, how easy it was to assume that intimacy was a trick, that kindness was a setup. But Daniel hadn't asked her to believe in him blindly. He'd simply asked her not to disappear. 3 days later, she called him. "Hi," she said when he answered. There was a pause, and then his voice quiet, controlled, but beneath it, something shifted. "Hi. I read your letter. I hoped you would." She hesitated. "I still don't know what this is." "I don't either," he said. "But I'd like to find out with you." Her fingers curled tighter around the phone. "And if I change my mind tomorrow, then I'll thank you for today." She let out a slow breath. "Coffee?" she asked. "I'll bring it." The next morning, Daniel arrived at her door with 2 paper cups and no assumptions. They sat on her porch again, just like before, but something had softened between them. Margot wasn't trying to protect herself with sarcasm or silence. She was simply there. "I get overwhelmed," she told him. Daniel nodded. "So do I. I think too much. And then I talk myself out of things. I overanalyze everything," he admitted. "Except with you." She looked at him, searching for the trick, the performance, the angle. But there was none. And maybe that scared her more than anything. Because this wasn't a man trying to win her. This was a man trying to meet her. Certainly. Here is part 8 of your story. The days that followed were quiet, but not the lonely kind Margot had grown used to. They were the kind of quiet filled with deliberate pauses, moments where she stopped reaching for distraction and simply let herself be. Daniel didn't rush her. He didn't call every morning or send lavish gestures. Instead, he offered steady presence. A text that said, "Hope today was kind to you." A voicemail once, after a long day, where he simply read her a few lines from a poem he found tucked in the back of an old book. She didn't reply right away, but she listened. One Saturday afternoon, they found themselves sitting in her backyard. Autumn was giving way to the slow gray of early November, and the garden that once burst with color now stood muted still, like it, too, was waiting to see what would grow again. Daniel crouched beside one of the long abandoned raised beds, gently lifting a brittle stem between his fingers. "This could come back," he said, "with time." Margot watched him, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea. "I let it go. After Ben died, I couldn't bear to touch it." Daniel didn't respond with pity. He just nodded, as if the truth of it needed no embellishment. "I'd like to help you start over," he said eventually. "Only if you want to." Margot set her mug down. "Do you know what that means, starting over with someone like me?" Daniel stood, brushing dirt off his hands. "Someone like you." She nodded. "Someone who doesn't pretend she's fine. Someone who's still figuring out how to breathe without flinching." He stepped toward her slowly, never pushing. "I'm not asking you to be fine," he said. "I'm asking you to be honest." Margot searched his face for hesitation, but all she found was calm certainty. Not arrogance, not rescue, just steadiness. She looked down at her hands, fingers curled slightly in her lap. "I haven't had anyone choose me in a long time," she whispered. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quiet. "Then let this be the first time in a while." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away. Over the next several weeks, they stitched a rhythm together, not a routine, but a shared understanding. Saturday mornings became coffee on the porch. Tuesday evenings, she'd leave her porch light on if she wanted company. Sometimes they talked for hours. Other times, they sat in silence that didn't ask to be filled. Margot noticed the changes before she acknowledged them. She started brushing her hair before leaving the house, even if only to check the mail. She bought a new notebook and filled the first 3 pages with thoughts that weren't meant for anyone else. One evening, Daniel arrived with a small wooden box. "For you," he said. Margot raised an eyebrow. "Is this the part where you overwhelm me with expensive gifts?" He smiled. "Open it." Inside was a set of hand tools, clean, practical, nothing ornate. A spade, a trowel, gardening gloves. "Thought we could bring the garden back," he said. Margot stared at the tools, her throat tightening. "This is kind," she managed. "It's not about the garden," he said softly. "It's about helping something grow again, even if it takes time." She didn't cry, but she set the box down slowly, as if it held something more fragile than steel and fabric. That night, as they stood in the quiet between her porch and the door, she said it. "Daniel." He turned. "I want to try." His smile didn't bloom fast. It arrived slowly, carefully, like someone who had waited and understood the weight of what had just been given. "So do I." It was an invitation, not a test, at least. That's how Daniel framed it when he asked Margot to accompany him to a benefit dinner hosted by one of his company's philanthropic partners. A quiet evening, he said. Nothing flashy. She almost declined. The words had perched on her tongue for a full 10 seconds before she pushed them down and nodded instead. Just don't make me wear anything sequined, she'd joked. No sequins, he promised, smiling. Just you. The event was held at a gallery in the city, tucked inside a converted industrial space with tall ceilings and warm lighting, the kind of place where even the shadows looked expensive. Margot stepped out of the car in a simple black dress that skimmed her frame without asking for attention. She had spent too long wondering if she belonged at events like this, and not enough time believing she had every right to. Daniel met her at the entrance, offering his arm without a word. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet elegance, well-dressed donors murmuring about impact reports, champagne flutes glinting beneath sculptural light fixtures. A string quartet played something delicate in the corner. Margot walked beside Daniel, matching his pace, but part of her felt like she was trying to keep up with a world that spoke a different language. Everyone here seemed fluent in influence, and while she had spent her life shaping words, she wasn't sure how to shape herself here. They paused near a modern installation, a steel sculpture that looked like a cage, halfway dismantled. I don't understand it, she whispered. Daniel glanced at the piece. I think that's the point. She smiled. So we're all just pretending we belong. He looked at her, something warm flickering behind his eyes. Most people are just trying not to be found out. That made her laugh, really laugh, for the first time that evening. But then it happened. A woman approached, sleek dress, perfectly styled gray hair, and a familiarity in her tone that tugged at Margot's stomach. Daniel, she said, air-kissing both sides of his face. I haven't seen you since Zurich. Daniel smiled politely. Elaine, it's been a while. Elaine turned to Margot, appraising. And who is this lovely mystery Margot Hale? He said simply. She's with me. Elaine extended her hand, lips curved in something between a smirk and a smile. Ah, a writer-editor, Margot replied, keeping her tone even. Of course, Elaine said, as if it explained everything. You always had a soft spot for thoughtful women. Margot felt her chest tighten. The conversation floated on a few more pleasantries before Elaine melted back into the crowd like perfume lingering and hard to shake. Daniel turned to her. You okay? Margot nodded, but it wasn't true. Later, over dessert at their table near the gallery windows, Margot finally found the words. This world of yours. It's not made for people like me. Daniel's brow furrowed. What does that mean? It means I'm not polished. I don't network. I don't know what wine pairs with what fundraising metric. I'm not strategic. You think I care about any of that? You say you don't, she said, voice tightening. But it's easy not to care when you've always belonged. Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. You think I belong in these rooms? He asked. I walk in and feel like a fraud every time. They see the name, the company, the articles, and none of them see me. Margot met his gaze, but they still listen, and I still feel invisible. He said, until you. She looked down, unsure what to do with the weight of his honesty. You're the only person who doesn't see me as a brand, he added. You look at me like I'm just here. Silence stretched between them. Then softly, she said, you scare me. His voice dropped. Why? Because I want to believe you, and that's dangerous. Daniel didn't flinch. He reached for her hand under the table, lacing his fingers with hers. Then let's be dangerous. Doubt doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes, it slips in quietly through an offhand comment, a familiar insecurity, or a memory you thought had already been laid to rest. For Margot, it came on a Thursday morning, delivered with a text from Cindy. Saw this online. Thought you should know. Love you. No judgment. Link attached. Margot hesitated before clicking it. She already knew deep down that nothing good ever came from links sent with disclaimers. The headline was clear: Power and Secrets. Daniel Whitaker's Quiet Empire and the Women Who Walked Away. She read the article in full, then again, and then again, until the words began to blur. It wasn't an attack piece. It was subtler than that, which somehow made it worse. It painted a picture of a man who kept his life compartmentalized, who never married, who had a history of intense but brief relationships. Words like emotionally reserved, strategically private, and incapable of lasting intimacy were thrown around, often accompanied by anonymous sources who claimed they didn't really know him at all. The article wasn't cruel. It was cold, clinical, like it had measured him and found him almost trustworthy, but not quite. By the time she finished reading, Margot's tea had gone cold. Her hands trembled slightly, though she couldn't say if it was from anger or something closer to grief. When Daniel called later that evening, she let it ring twice before answering. "Hey," he said, voice soft. "Hey." There was a pause. "You saw it?" "Yes." Another pause. "Do you want to talk about it?" She swallowed. "I don't know." Daniel's voice didn't change. It remained steady, deliberate. "I won't defend gossip. And I won't explain away things that are mine to carry. But if you want to ask me anything, I'll tell you the truth." Margot leaned against her kitchen counter, the weight of her own silence pressing down. "Is it true?" she asked. Daniel didn't dodge. "Some of it, enough to be uncomfortable." "Have you hurt people? I've disappointed people," he said quietly, "especially when I didn't know what I wanted or how to show up for someone else. I've kept walls up because it felt safer, but I've never used anyone, and I've never lied about who I am." Margot closed her eyes. Her chest felt tight with the ache of uncertainty. "I don't want to be a name on a list." "Daniel, you're not." "You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow, too." His certainty didn't come across as performance. It wasn't loud or romantic. It was tired, honest, worn from use, but still true. She began, and then stopped. "What is it?" he asked. "I'm trying to figure out if this is worth the risk." Daniel didn't fill the space with promises or pleas. He just let it sit. Then he said, "So am I." They didn't see each other for 4 days. Margot needed the space. Daniel gave it. She spent the weekend walking trails near her house, turning off her phone, and rereading parts of her old journal, the one she'd used when Ben was sick. She wasn't comparing the two men. It wasn't about them. It was about her, about how many times she'd chosen safety over truth, distance over vulnerability, and how many more times she was willing to do it again. By Monday evening, she had her answer. Not because she found certainty, but because the absence of Daniel felt louder than the presence of fear. She showed up at his office unannounced. The receptionist blinked, startled, but didn't question her. Within minutes, Daniel was stepping out of a glass conference room, surprised but calm. Margot met his eyes. "I'm not here for a tour. Didn't think you were. I don't have a plan. Okay, She took a breath. "I wanted you to see me choosing this. Choosing you, even when it scares the hell out of me." Daniel's face didn't break into a grin or shift into a movie scene confession. Instead, he stepped forward, close enough to touch, but didn't. "I'm still scared too," he said. Margot looked at him, her voice soft. "Good." And then, finally, she reached for his hand. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay. Margot didn't expect things to shift overnight. There was no grand transformation, no cinematic montage of blooming flowers, handwritten notes, or sweeping orchestral crescendos. What came instead was something smaller, more sacred. Stillness. A new kind of quiet settled into her days, not the hollow silence she had grown used to, but the kind that made space for breath, for trust, for possibility. Daniel never rushed her. He didn't call every hour or try to overwrite the doubts with grand gestures. He simply kept showing up on Tuesdays with takeout, on Fridays with old books he thought she'd love, sometimes with questions, sometimes just with a listening ear, and Margot began to feel steady, not healed, not finished, but less fragmented. One morning, as golden light spilled through the windows of her kitchen, she opened a drawer that had remained untouched for years. Inside was a manuscript. Her own. One she had begun writing years ago. in the soft haze of a hopeful past. The pages were brittle around the edges, her handwriting tight, structured, almost apologetic. She stared at it for a long moment, unsure if the version of her who had written those words still existed. Later that night, when Daniel dropped by with dinner and a tired smile, she set the manuscript in front of him. "What's this?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Something I buried," she said, "a story I never thought I'd finish." Daniel opened the first page and ran a finger gently down the margin. "It's yours," he asked. "It was," Margot said. "I'd like it to be again." He didn't say, "You should publish it," or "This is brilliant," or "You're amazing." Instead, he said, "Would you like me to read it?" She nodded, unsure why the question moved her so deeply, because it wasn't about the story. It was about being seen, not for what she'd done, but for what she still had the courage to attempt. A week later, Margot sat in the audience of a small community event at the local library. She was scheduled to read an excerpt from her manuscript as part of a new writer's showcase. She hadn't planned to tell Daniel, but he showed up anyway. He stood in the back, arms crossed, not needing the front row, not needing applause, just being there. When she walked off the makeshift stage, heart pounding, she found him waiting near the side exit. "You didn't have to come," she said. "Of course I did. I didn't even tell you. You didn't need to." And with that, Margot Hale did something she hadn't done in years. She reached for someone. Later, as they walked through the sleepy city streets beneath amber streetlights, Margot said, almost casually, "You know, I never believed I'd have anything to say again." "Not really." Daniel glanced at her. "But you did." She looked down at the sidewalk. "Only because someone reminded me that my voice still mattered." "You reminded yourself," he corrected gently. "I just sat in the audience." "No," she said, stopping mid-step. "You did more than that." She turned toward him, eyes steady. "You didn't try to save me, Daniel. You let me save myself." A soft wind moved through the trees above them. Cars rolled by slowly in the distance, their headlights casting gentle shadows across the pavement. "I'm proud of you," he said, barely above a whisper. Margot exhaled. "I'm starting to be..." They stood in silence for a moment, comfortable, rooted, and then Daniel reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small, square envelope. Margot raised an eyebrow. "Should I be nervous?" He smiled. "No sequins. I promise." Inside was a letter. One line, handwritten in his careful print. "There's no finish line here, just one step after another. I'd like to take the next one with you." Margot closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Not a proposal, not a promise of forever, just a truth. And that, somehow, felt bigger than anything else. Winter passed gently, like a long exhale. Margot had always found the cold months difficult, too quiet, too still. But that year, they became something else entirely. She found comfort in the ritual of it all, the soft clatter of mugs on the porch railing, Daniel's jacket slung over the back of her reading chair, the hum of something steady between them. It wasn't about grand gestures. It never had been. It was about showing up, day after day, without performance, without expectation, just presence. On the anniversary of the wedding where they met, Daniel asked if she'd like to return to the venue. Not for nostalgia, he said, just for perspective. She agreed, curious more than sentimental. They drove north together, along the same winding roads, past the same barns and stone walls dusted in late spring frost. When they arrived, the estate stood quiet, unbooked for the day. The staff, who remembered Daniel well, let them walk the grounds undisturbed. They made their way to the old garden tucked behind the dining hall. It had changed, freshly planted, signs of care, but it was still the same in spirit. Daniel knelt beside one of the flower beds and smiled. "Looks like someone took your advice." Margot nudged him with her shoulder. "Our advice." They sat on the wooden bench where it had all begun that quiet evening, that first honest conversation. Daniel pulled something from his coat pocket. Small, simple. Margot's breath caught, just for a moment. But it wasn't a ring, It was a bracelet brushed gold, with a small charm shaped like a typewriter. "For your stories," he said, "the ones you're still writing." Margot turned the charm over in her fingers, her heart catching up to the moment. "I didn't expect this," she whispered. "You didn't expect me," he corrected gently. "But here we are." She met his eyes. "And what is this?" "Exactly," Daniel's voice was steady. "It's a beginning, a continuation, a choice." Margot looked at the garden, the quiet sky above them, and then back at the man who had entered her life like a whisper, but stayed like a vow. "I never believed in forever," she admitted. Daniel reached for her hand, warm and sure. "That's okay. I believe in right now, and in every right now after that." They didn't rush into anything, not a wedding, not a new home, not a timetable. Their lives remained separate in the ways that mattered, and intertwined in all the ones that did. He still traveled for work. She still found herself lost in edits until midnight. They argued over books and tea temperatures and which way to hang the dish towel. But beneath it all, there was a current neither of them questioned anymore. It was trust, and choice, and time. One morning, Margot woke up before sunrise. She slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in Daniel's sweater, and padded barefoot to her desk. There, she opened her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard for a beat longer than usual. Then she began to write, not out of obligation, but because something inside her was blooming again. A new story. Not about Daniel, not about love, but about starting again, about staying, about how we sometimes meet ourselves in the places we least expect, sitting next to strangers, on days we never planned to show up, and how, if we're lucky, we're brave enough to say yes. Sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places, a wedding, a bookstore, a quiet garden after a long winter. But what stays with us isn't where the story started. It's how it made us feel. It's the reminder that even after loss, after silence, after years of holding your breath, you can begin again. Margot and Daniel didn't fall into love. They chose it, slowly, deliberately, in a world that often rewards performance over presence, status over sincerity. Their story reminds us of the quiet power of seeing someone for who they really are. And it also reminds us of this: behind every person is a past you cannot see. Behind every guarded smile, every quiet seat at the table, may be someone like Margot, trying to heal. Someone like Daniel, hoping not to be judged by a headline or a title. So, let's stop assuming. Let's stop measuring people by what they have, where they've been, or how they fit in. Because the moment we start listening before labeling, we begin to change more than just our own lives. We change the world around us. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where every voice matters, and every story is a chance to heal, grow, and connect. And if you're still with us, stay tuned. The next story might just find you.